between the years when the oceans drank Atlantis and the gleaming cities, and the years of the rise of the sons of Ares, there was an age undreamed of when shining kingdoms lay spread across the world like blue mantles beneath the stars. Welcome to Antiquity X. I'm your host, Dr. Judd Burton. Welcome back. As always, if you like the content, please click a like, subscribe, and share. And today we will be considering the possibility of giants in the Americas. And I have to say that this episode is actually an answer to a request some months back earlier at the beginning of the year. And I cannot remember with the life of me who made the request, but I thought that, I didn't get around to doing that, so I probably should. It's an interesting topic, one that deserves attention and consideration. And I think that all three axes that I use to research giants, the mythological, the textual, and the material, you'll find those evidences for. And so I have three interesting examples for you that we'll look at today. Now, most of you who follow my work and are interested in this sort of thing are familiar with the world of giants and the fallen angels from the perspective of the Bible. And certainly giants, mythologically speaking, are a perennial feature in world culture. In terms of the biblical context, personalities like Goliath, Og, Sihon, Arba, tribes like the Rephaim, the Nephilim, the Anakim, the Zamzummim, all these names will be familiar. The Mesopotamian Anunnaki, the Egyptian Shasu, Celtic Fomors, the Germanic Norse Jotun, giants in the Americas like the Sitaka, amongst the Paiute. You spin the globe and you're going to run into traditions that deal with giants over time and space. These semi-divine conquerors and empire and city builders. There are indeed many cases of giants in the Americas. Many are not legitimate, but many of them are. The existence of such creatures is attested in native lore extensively, and to a degree in archaeology and ethnology. Factoring in, of course, the recovery of some of these remains and their announcements in the newspapers of the 1800s and early 1900s as kind of yellow journalism or fake news for the time. There probably were some finds that were passed off that were actually megafauna or dinosaur bones or something. But the fact remains is that the recovery of this evidence begins with no less personage than George Washington, who uncovered giant remains on his own property. And there are, in fact, many of these sorts of creatures that existed in native lore amongst virtually all of the tribes of the Americas. Now, the question remains, how exactly did these creatures, these giants, get here? Well, in Interview with the Giant, I worked out a theory called on the giant diaspora in a chapter called Out of Canaan, in which they used a western trajectory and at the end of the Bronze Age came to other parts of the world, including the Americas, Central America, where civilization sprouted up amongst the Olmec and the Maya to begin with. You saw the colossal head, and here represented the accoutrements and jewelry of Pakal the Great, the ruler of Palenque in the 7th century A.D., and many of you will be familiar with how bloody the foundations of Mayan civilization were. Pakal was said to have been 10 or 11 feet tall. His sarcophagus was huge. Now, those examples that I told you about, the first one The first good case that I'm going to give you is that of the work of Cyrus Thomas, which I think is foundational in terms of the recovery of legitimate material evidence, osteological, paleontological evidence for the existence of giants. Thomas was a rather interesting character and ended up working with the Bureau of Ethnology under the auspices of the Smithsonian. The Bureau of Ethnology, of course, was tasked with recovering all kinds of native information in the Americas. But his task was to find the origins of the mound builders, who exactly built the mounds, particularly in the mid and upper reaches of the Mississippi River Valley and its branches. And of interest here is the report in the Bulletin of Ethnology in 1890 and 91 that recounts his work in Wisconsin on some specimens that were between 7 and 10 feet tall. So pretty interesting stuff. The second one that I wanted to reference is the find in Jalisco, the Jalisco region of Mexico by a well-known miner named Charles C. Clamp. And this is an interesting find. It could be dismissed only as as a newspaper headline or what have you. But what's interesting here is that he found apparently over 200 specimens. They were over 8 feet tall. One of them was 8 feet tall, 11 inches, according to another article. And the find is interesting because he references a Professor Agassiz, and this no doubt is the noted scientist and mining engineer Alexander Agassiz, who was the son of Professor Louis Agassiz, the great zoologist and former member of the Metaphysical Club at Harvard. So that puts this find in a rather interesting context. And the third and final find in the Americas that I think is one of the great legitimate finds is the Moorhus Mound giant, whose provenience is Victoria, Texas. This was conducted under the auspices of the WPA by archaeologist W.A. Duffin in conjunction with the University of Texas and the Texas Archaeological Research Lab. WPA, you may remember, is a FDR Depression era program to put scholars to work of various sorts, and archaeologists were certainly amongst them. At any rate, they recovered one skull that was about twice as large as the average person at the time. Now remember, even though coastal Indians were a little bit larger, the average height of natives was about 5.5 feet tall for the level of this find. The physical anthropologist found no evidence of acromegaly, no knobbing on the ends of bones that you would typically find. So this seems to be a legitimate find. And what I found interesting about it is that 2010 correspondence confirms that, in fact, this specimen is missing from the Tarl collection, and I talked myself to the curator of the Coastal Bend Museum in Victoria in 2016, and the official report is also missing. So there are some interesting and compelling giant finds. A lot of them are bogus, but in the Americas you do have some examples of great finds. I think the Moorhus giant find is a rather interesting and one of the more compelling finds in the Americas, just in terms of material evidence and analysis. But it all goes back to finding giant evidence along those three axes: mythology, text, and material. So keep up the search, do your own work, and I will see you again soon.